The blue whale is believed to be the biggest animal to have ever existed on Earth. But how can an animal even get so big? And is it possible that there was, or maybe will be, something bigger? Today, we're looking at big animals and trying to figure out what the actual biological limits on size are. Let's start with a real animal, then we can get into the hypothetical. Don't worry, we'll get to Godzilla later. Like I mentioned earlier, blue whales are the biggest animal that we know of. But how exactly do we measure big? Well, if we look at length, there might actually be some animals that were longer than the blue whale. There are dinosaurs that were actually longer than the blue whale, but that's if we measure from the tip of their snout to the tip of their tail. Reptiles are usually measured snout to vent. Here, vent just means butt. So the tail usually isn't counted. So if we measure the right way, then yeah, the blue whale is still longer. The neck and tail of these titanosaurs would have been relatively skinny, so the blue whales still would have been much heavier. There are also some ancient whale-like marine animals that are believed to possibly have been heavier than blue whales, but of course we haven't seen a living one, so we don't really know for sure. Based on the skeleton, though, they were definitely still shorter, they were just a little stockier. So even if they did outweigh the modern blue whale, they still wouldn't have been as long. The point here is that saying that the blue whale is the biggest isn't necessarily entirely true. It depends on how you measure, but also there are certain things that we just don't know. In modern times, though, it's definitely the biggest, but it would have had some real competition in ancient times. But I think the more important question here isn't if the blue whale is the biggest, but how can blue whales even get so big? Just to be clear, we're talking about blue whales here because they're still around and we can study them and find answers. So when we're looking for the biological reasons as to why an animal can get so big, the blue whale is our best place to look for answers. So how did blue whales get big? Well, it's actually a combination of a lot of different things. First off, their diet. Even though krill are really small, they're incredibly nutrient dense. This means that whale can get a ton of calories, literally, in a relatively short period. It's estimated that each mouthful of krill gives them about 90 times more energy than it took to catch it. Having a really nutrient-dense food source helps them build up their stores of fat during the summer at the poles. Then in the winter, they don't have to worry so much about feeding in the warmer but less krill-inhabited waters around the equator. And that's one of the other things that helps them get so big, is having those huge stores of fat. Whales can be up to 50% blubber, depending on the time of year. But even though the blubber helps them survive and thrive during those harsher months of the year, it can also be a bit of a burden. See, the bigger an animal is, the more energy it takes to move itself. But on the other side of that coin, the bigger an animal is, the more food it can get to support its large size. The problem here is that the energy gains go up much slower than the energy expenditure. So eventually you get diminishing returns on size increases. But why is the cutoff point so much bigger for whales than it is for other animals? I mean, a blue whale can be about 20 to 30 times larger than an elephant. Well, the answer here is that they live in the water. Now, we aren't going to get into a whole physics lecture here, but basically, buoyancy makes you feel lighter based on how much water you're displacing. So even though a blue whale is incredibly heavy, the biggest one was about 200 tons, it's also very large in size. So being in water makes it feel a lot lighter, and that helps it move around a little bit easier. The last important thing here that lets them get so big is the fact that they breathe air. The oxygen content of water is usually around 1%, but in air, it's about 24 or 25. So breathing air lets them get a lot more oxygen than water. So blue whales really had a workaround to all of the limitations that other animals have. Their diet and feeding techniques, along with their marine environment, mixed with the fact that they still breathe air, have led to them being the biggest modern animal. Now, some scientists have speculated that this is as big as you can get. If they got any bigger, they wouldn't be able to keep themselves fed because they would need more calories than they'd be able to catch. Some scientists think that it would also take whales too long to close their mouths if they were any bigger. so the krill would have time to see what was happening and be able to just swim out before the mouth shuts all the way. Now, these all sound like realistic limitations, but what if we could break some of these limitations too? What other weird obstacles would we find? Well, first, let's find a workaround for the calorie problem. Like I was talking about earlier, calorie expenditure goes up much faster than your ability to intake calories as size increases. But there's one giant monster that's found a really interesting solution. Before we go on, I just want to point out that a big chunk of the rest of this video is pretty much all speculation. We're going to try to base everything on known science as much as possible, but there is a lot of speculation from here on in. Okay, time to talk about Godzilla. So Godzilla solves this calorie problem by having an even more calorie-dense diet. Now, according to the actual lore, Godzilla can absorb radiation from power plants or nuclear fallout, or in some cases, just the atmosphere. He can also just eat uranium. It seems like the general consensus is that Godzilla needs just over 200 million calories per day. Now, based on some quick math, I found out that a single kilo of uranium would produce enough calories to fuel Godzilla for a few weeks. Now, I couldn't find out exactly how much uranium is on a nuclear sub, and I suspect that I'm on some kind of list now, but most estimates say that there's probably at least a few kilograms. So Godzilla could sustain themselves off of eating a nuclear sub every now and then, or potentially even just finding a uranium deposit and going for a quick snack. We were talking earlier about how calorie-dense krill were. Well, uranium is on a whole other level. So let's consider the calorie problem solved and move on to the next issue. The next thing I think we need to talk about is actually moving around. So there's this thing called the square cube law. Basically, as an object is scaled up, the surface area would increase by the square of the scaling factor, and the volume is increased by the cube of the scaling factor. We're not going to get into a whole math lecture here, but just give me 15 seconds to do a quick explanation. Let's take a look at a 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch cube. It would have a surface area of 6 square inches, 1 square inch on each of the faces, and a volume of 1 cubed inch. Now, if we doubled that in every direction, so that way we had a 2 inch by 2 inch by 2 inch cube, the total surface area would be 24 square inches, 6 2 by 2 faces. That is increased by a factor of 4, or 2 squared. The volume would now be 8 cubic inches. That's increased by a factor of 8, or 2 cubed. Here's a chart showing what happens when we increase the factor by 3 and 4, so you can see that the volume increases way faster than surface area. And this causes a few problems. First of all, overall strength. See, overall strength of a muscle is determined by the size of the cross-section of a muscle, or how thick it is. But overall weight of a limb is determined by volume. In other words, the strength of a muscle increases with the square, but the weight increases with the cube. Since weight is getting bigger so much faster than strength, eventually the limb would just be too heavy to lift. The opposite is true too. Weight would go down faster than strength. That's why small animals seem so strong relative to their size. A flea can jump about 150 times its own height, but humans can only do a small fraction of that, and elephants can't even jump at all. So as you get bigger, your relative strength drops. But we already have a solution to that. Whales make themselves weightless by living in water. But there's another setting that might work too. Space. There are a few sci-fi stories with large space animals, and it's actually a good way to get around weight limitations. Plenty of other problems come up though. How do you breathe? How do you move? What do you do to eat? But let's get back to the square cube law. If an animal got too big, it wouldn't even be able to move its own limbs, even if it was in a low or no gravity environment. It's hard to calculate exactly how big that would be before it became a serious issue, but we'll get back to more on this stuff in the final section. The other issue that the square cube law brings up is the issue of heat dissipation. Heat is generated by every cell in the body. Any process it does, there's always a little bit of energy that gets lost as heat. The more it does, the more heat builds up. That's why you get hot when you exercise. Heat dissipation is determined by two things: the difference in temperature between the two objects, in this case the organism's skin and the air or water around them, and the total area of contact. For an organism, the total contact area would just be all of its skin, unless it has fur, but let's not complicate things too much. So, according to the square cube law, volume, and thus cell and cellular heat, would go up with the cube, but total surface area of the skin would go up by the square. Eventually, an organism would get so big that its body wouldn't be able to get rid of the heat as fast as it produced it. But what if it had some kind of cooling system? Plenty of animals have evolved adaptations to help keep them cool. Pigs hang out in mud, rabbits have big ears to help cool down their blood before it recirculates, and us humans have sweat. But if we're talking about a massive animal, these might not be enough. It would be reasonable to think that a new kind of cooling system could evolve to accommodate a large animal. Evolution has given us some really weird things, so I think some kind of internal liquid cooling system isn't totally out of the question. Again, with rabbits, we kind of already have a liquid-based internal cooling system. The blood goes to the ears to cool down and then recirculates through their body. Another big issue that we run into, though, is that nerves don't transmit signals fast enough. Pain receptors are especially slow. If an animal bites a blue whale's tail, it could be several seconds until it even realizes it. We don't have the exact timing on these things. Again, blue whales are kind of hard to study due to their size. But we do have general knowledge about how fast different neurons are. And this happens in humans too. When someone touches something that's too hot, they don't always immediately remove their hand. They do remove it faster than it would take to get the signal all the way up to the brain and back. See, biology has found more than a few ways to take a few shortcuts here and there. Reflexes don't require a signal to go all the way to the brain. The spinal cord actually has quite a bit of neurons in it, and there's some really basic processing that can happen in the spinal cord. In order to save time and prevent potential risk to the body, the spinal cord can send out a reaction to pain to quickly pull your hand or foot away from the danger. That's why it often seems like you react to something before you even realize that it's hurting you. Some animals have taken this to an even further extreme. Octopi have smaller mini brains in each of their arms that can independently control the arm, while the main central brain in their head handles higher functions. A distributed nervous system like this could help support an animal as it gets larger and larger. Nervous system signals have a pretty wide range of speeds, depending on the type of signal and the type of neuron and a lot of other factors. But even with some of the fastest neurons, it can still be somewhat slow. If Godzilla stepped on something and hurt its foot, it would take at least several seconds for that signal to get to his brain, then he would need to decide how to react and send that signal back. A distributed nervous system with mini brains in his spine or legs would drastically reduce the reaction time and generally help with coordination. So with a really large animal, I think it's reasonable to think that something like this could help them survive and thrive a little bit better. A distributed system like this would almost function more like several smaller beings acting as one, but if an organism was big enough, then this is really the only kind of nervous system that would work for it. The last thing I want to talk about here is gravity. Now, we already talked about how being in water or space can help reduce overall weight. And one thread I found online suggests that Godzilla's bones and muscles could be made out of carbon nanotubes to further increase strength and reduce weight. But we're not going to get too far into that right now. Anyway, if a creature was big enough, it would generate its own gravity. Now, if it was on a planet, that wouldn't necessarily be as big of a deal. But if it was the size of a planet, then it could be much more of an issue. If a planet-sized creature existed, then the internal gravity would be so much that its internal organs would be crushed. So either way, there would have to be some kind of maximum size that something can be. I know there are a lot of rabbit holes that we didn't go down, but for the sake of keeping this video to a reasonable length, let's move on. So, given all of this information about real animals and fictional ones, what would our hypothetical biggest animal look like? Well, first of all, I think it would have to live in the ocean. I don't think an animal could live in the vacuum of space, but biology can be kind of weird sometimes, so who knows? Perhaps it would be able to form a symbiotic relationship with plants that would help it photosynthesize solar energy. There are all kinds of other weird things like that could potentially help an animal survive in space, but I feel like at that point it would almost kind of be more like a colony of various animals and not one single being. Anyway, our hypothetical animal would also have to be able to breathe air, as extracting enough oxygen from the water would take way too much energy. And speaking of energy, it would need a really calorie-dense energy source, or possibly a hunting method that doesn't require very many calories. At first I was thinking maybe it could live off of hydrothermal vents. The chemicals and heat have shown to be a great source of food and nutrients, but our creature would already have a heat problem, and it would need access to the oxygen in the air, so probably it wouldn't be able to live in a deep sea trench on a hydrothermal vent. But if it could process radiation like Godzilla, that could certainly help it meet some of its caloric needs. There have been some fungi that can actually use radiation as a food source, so having this massive creature have some kind of rudimentary nuclear power plant that is supported by similar things that these fungi use, then that could maybe work. Now, let's talk about mobility and hunting. I don't think this thing would be able to move very much. Like we were talking about earlier, as the size of a creature increases, it becomes relatively weaker. I think this thing would just be floating around in the ocean with maybe a few fins or jets to help it maneuver and make sure it doesn't get beached. Oh, and that brings me to what it would actually look like. I see this thing as kind of a self-sustaining floating island. There are a few reasons why a floating island monster would be able to support itself. First, I think that there would be a lot of room for symbiotic relationships with plants and animals that would help to feed and maintain it. I don't think that it would actively hunt. It would be a passive hunter like jellyfish. The bionuclear reactor wouldn't be enough to fully feed it, and so it would still need supplemental calories and nutrients from other sources. So I think it would probably have dangling tentacles like jellyfish and have multiple two-way mouths. That way it could have a very low energy source of bringing in food. Basically, I picture the bottom of this thing looking like a ton of jellyfish all packed together. It would also be able to filter feed. It would take in water at the front and direct it through internal feeders like sea sponges do. Then it could jet the water out the back to help it move and steer. This could also help with the cooling, as moving water through its body could help keep it cool. The nervous system would have to be distributed like an octopus, with multiple mini brains throughout, all monitoring and regulating local functions. Though, due to the size of this thing, each mini brain would probably be closer to the size of a minivan, at least. It would have to have some kind of cardiovascular system to help distribute nutrients and calories, though given its size, it might be more like several smaller systems, each serving a subsection of the beast with specialized organs to help move blood and nutrients from one system to another. Something like this probably wouldn't have eyes. There wouldn't be much need. Nothing would be able to prey on it, and due to the passive nature of its energy production, it wouldn't really need to hunt. And as far as overall size, I think our floating island monster could be much bigger than Godzilla, potentially even up to half a mile long, or maybe even longer. It would need to be fairly flat, though, to help with the heat dispersion. Having the water flow through its body would certainly help get rid of some of the heat, but unless we wanted to have those water tubes winding and going all throughout it in every which way, it would probably need to maintain a relatively flat shape. This thing would almost function like a colony of animals in that each section and each mini brain is kind of self-sustaining in its own way, but it would still be part of one bigger animal, and all of those mini brains would still be tied to one giant central brain that would be able to process higher functions more than just running all of the local organs. So yeah, a giant, relatively flat, floating island that hunts passively for the most part, but does try to find uranium to feed its internal reactor. Now, how would something like this even get uranium? I think this is one of those things where it would be able to form a symbiotic relationship with some kind of bird or other animal that would be able to go out, look for uranium, gather some, feed it to the beast, and then the beast is able to provide something in return, such as shelter or possibly food. Now, that's just if this thing was on Earth and based on Earth biology. I think that a giant creature could exist on other planets, and life on other planets would have totally different systems. Potentially even be silicone based instead of carbon based, or have just totally different processes that we can't even think of on Earth. So who knows what some kind of megafauna on other planets would look like, but it's fun to think about. Let me know in the comments what you think. That's all I have for you guys today. Make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps out smaller channels like me. And if you're a regular, I'm sure you've noticed my production schedule has slowed down a little bit. It's mainly because I'm working more, but I'm still trying to do a video at least every other week. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and remember to stay curious.